to thank you all for coming out. I know that in the summertime, and there's no ice and snow on the ground, that we Michiganders like to get out and enjoy this beautiful state we live in. As you see, there are a number of lawn signs that we would encourage you to take one and display it. These are due to the generosity of the Women's Action Movement, who've taken this on as a key part of what they're doing. So feel free, and I don't think they'll be all gone. We have, I think, plenty, but if not, stick around and give us your name, and we'll try and make arrangements to get you one. So I'd also like to thank Howard Stein for arranging this facility for us, and for the Pittsfield Township for making it available. We're honored, of course, to have Representative Dingle, who honors us with her presence. At the conclusion of today's remarks, we're going to break up into small groups, and we'd like you to stay for that, one of which, of course, is going to be on the issue of what we can do to support immigrants. And Protectors of Equality in Government, the sponsor of today's event, exists to see that we have a government that treats everybody with equality and with acceptance. And the way we attempt to do that is by having everyone get engaged in the process of holding our government accountable for these values. We are a radically civil organization. We are nonpartisan. We believe in treating everyone, no matter what their viewpoints, with respect. And one of the ways that we want to keep people engaged is by breaking into these smaller groups who will meet on a regular basis, and you'll hear more about that. So at the conclusion meeting, we'll see who is interested in discussing which of these events. One of the ways that we help people know what to do is with a newsletter and with our Facebook page, equalityingov.org. If you're not getting our newsletter, please leave your name, where you signed in. The last column you can check to get the newsletter. So we've got a dedicated group of folks who work on that every week. And also, if you know of events or organizations whose events we should be publicizing, please let me know or any of the other PEG people around here today. We would like to make this as comprehensive as we possibly can. And as I said, we want to encourage other organizations. We want to encourage people to get involved with other organizations that have similar aims as our own. The only thing that we ask is that they too be radically civil and share our mission of having our government treat everyone with equality and with acceptance. So with that, I would like to introduce Adele Hammond-Sass. Oh, there you are, who will introduce our speaker today. And Adele is one of the folks who've been very active with PEG on the immigration issue, and somebody to meet.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm very honored to be here. My name's Adele, and after our talk, I'll be with the Immigration Action Circle. Since the election, like many of you, I've been moved to do things that I wasn't doing before. So I'm very pleased to be here today to introduce Sheriff Clayton. He has an extensive biography and has been in the criminal justice profession for over 29 years and is serving his third term as Sheriff of Washtenaw County. He leads a staff of 420, and we have a population here of about 350,000 people. I said that I wouldn't make it a long introduction, but he has worn many different hats in his career, and is here as he has served as a corrections commander, police services commander, and even a SWAT team commander. He's worked with the ACLU, the Department of Justice, and the National Sheriff's Association. And I know that he has been very, very involved in both working with immigrants in Washtenaw County, the way that we're going forward, as well as being concerned about mental health and drug issues. So I'm pleased to introduce Sheriff Clayton. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. You did a great job. So I asked her, I said, don't read the whole thing. It's embarrassing. It's way too long, and it gives everybody a false impression and expectations of what's to come. So I want to keep that bar like really, really low. First off, let me say thank you very much to Chuck and PEG for inviting me to come out here today. Let me say thank you to all of you for spending your Sunday thinking about how we contribute to the greater good, right? Somebody said somewhere a long time ago that we get to what kind of society that we both ask for and demand. And if we're not satisfied with our current state of affairs, the first place we all need to look is where? In the mirror. And if we've done, what have we done to contribute to the greater good, or if we're all honest, contribute to the current state of affairs and commit ourselves to changing. So before I get started, all of you are dignitaries and important people. There's one person that was already acknowledged. There's another person in the back. All the way in the back is County Commissioner Jason Morgan. Thank you for spending some time with us today. And I asked Representative Dingell to come up and just share a few words with us. I mean, you cannot have her come to a meeting and not partake in some of her wisdom. So, Representative Dingell, if you would do us this favor and share some words, we would greatly appreciate it.
Good afternoon. I told Jerry I didn't need to speak, and he said, no, yes, you do. I hope you all know how lucky we are to have a sheriff with the leadership that Jerry Clayton has. He is a man that has a huge heart and cares deeply. He wants to keep everybody in this community safe and understands that that's always his number one goal. But he treats every single individual with respect and with dignity. He understands there are so many complex issues. I've been really proud to work with him on the Black Lives Matter issues, as we've seen race be so important in this community, and the subject that he's going to talk about today, again, on immigration. I mean, I can't believe, and I want to say again that he was a leader. You know, we've had some issues and some incidences in this community. How we respond, how we all pull together really matters. And Jerry took the lead on pulling all of us together to make sure we were being responsive, appropriate, and continues to do that. So I just can't tell you how lucky we are to have such a good man as the sheriff in Washtenaw County, and want to say that. And you know, you came to hear him, so I'm going to exit to the stage right here, or left, I guess. You're right, who knows. But that's the problem. Who does know? I am going to make this observation. 2 weeks ago on my Facebook page, I did a rant because it was the day after there had been the rallies against Sharia law in this country, and I simply posted, Dearborn, Michigan does not have Sharia law, and Dearborn, Michigan will never have Sharia law. And the hateful posts that were on my Facebook page, I know they all tell us not to read them, they tell us not to pay attention, but I did. And on my Facebook page that night, I said, we have to stop this demonization of each other. We have to stop trying to divide us with fear and hatred. And then the next week, we saw this horrible shooting at the baseball field against Republicans. And honestly, my first reaction, I knew what and where it was. And I knew there were 3 Michigan members who are my friends that are on that team. And my reaction was, are they okay? Is everybody okay? We've got to all start looking inside of ourselves about what is happening in our society, in our community. And when we hear people demonizing each other, we hear people framing things, we have to say stop. We can disagree. It would be boring if we all agreed with each other all of the time, but we need to treat each other with respect, with dignity. We have to think about what's happening in our communities that we've become so divided. So I can't think of a better time to have this discussion. I really worry when I live in Dearborn, and some of you have heard me say this. I've had little kids who are cried, and now it's not one, it's 30 of them since January, who've said to me they're afraid somebody's going to knock on the door. They're American citizens. They have passports. Their parents are second generation. Some of these kids are third generation. And it takes you back to the Holocaust because they say it's clearly been discussed at school. Someone's going to knock on our door, pull us out of our home, and deport us or send us someplace, and they're not going to be safe. Hey, this is America. The fundamental pillars of our Constitution is freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Let's remember who we are, and that's what you all are about. Civility, and today's discussion is really an important discussion. So thank you, and I'm proud to be with you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Representative Dingle. Again, elections matter, right? We know that more than anything. So we're fortunate to have the kind of representative that takes that message back to D.C. Gosh, I wish we could have about 400 other folks that had that same message, right? Let's work on, let's find out what our commonalities are, what our focus is in terms of making our country better, and focus on that. But we are not there yet. So let's talk a little bit about immigration. So here was the challenge for me in the period of time that I have. First off, I hate lecterns, but I got so much information, I'll probably stay sort of anchored to this, is how much information to share, and what kind of information. So I'm going to start almost at the beginning into January with the 2 executive orders that came from President Trump. So we've been facing this challenge around immigration far before this president got elected, right? So we all know that. But it's the things that the policy positions that he has taken, and the way that he and the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security have chosen to enforce federal immigration law, that has caused us much angst and anxiety, especially as it relates to trying to recruit state and local officials and law enforcement organizations to be part of what I call the posse that focuses on folks that are undocumented in a way that we know challenges our greater community. So I want to talk about really, really quick to sort of frame it with 2 executive orders that came out in January 25th of this year. The first one is enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States. So this one is sort of focused on a couple of things, and I just want to hit the highlights, and I want to read just a short excerpts to sort of frame it for us. So there's a part in here that says sanctuary city jurisdictions across the United States willfully violate federal law in an attempt to shield aliens from removal from the United States. These jurisdictions have caused immeasurable harm to the American people and the very fabric of our republic. So there are a couple things we know that are just factually untrue. That, quote, first off, we don't know how you define a sanctuary jurisdiction. I am not a sanctuary cities definition kind of guy. I believe in welcoming communities, and the reason why we should be careful around the sanctuary cities because executive orders like this try to define things a certain way and put people on a certain side. So there is no data, there's no empirical data, no factual data that shows that any of the welcoming communities violate federal law. The only federal law that is germane here is part of is 1373, which really speaks to a requirement for state and local jurisdictions upon, if they are requested from federal authorities, to share information the information that they have relative to the immigration status of someone. I don't know of any jurisdiction that has policies that prohibit the sharing of that information. There's no requirement in the Constitution, there's no requirement in federal law that jurisdictions voluntarily do this, that proactively do it. Quite frankly, 1373 just requires, if you are asked by federal authorities, that you are to provide that information. So when you see most of the jurisdictions say, well, we are a welcoming community, sanctuary city, whatever you want to say, because we don't ask and we don't voluntarily work collaboratively with federal immigration, that's not a violation of federal law. There's nothing that says, I'm not an attorney, but I'm sure there's 1 or 2 in here that will correct me if I'm wrong. Here's the other piece that's troubling to me. What the president has done in both of these executive orders and in additional rhetoric is essentially make this equation that immigrant, not undocumented, not anything, immigrant equals what? Crime and criminality. Now, we know our history, right? This isn't the first group where that particular group has been equated with crime and criminality. If we're going to talk and we're going to be real, and that's the only way I know how to be, as African Americans, we know this. We know this and have known this for the period of time that we've been in this country. This is a play that's been run repeatedly. So essentially what the president is doing is saying, look, whatever your ills are, they are caused by these individuals that are in this country illegally. If we get rid of these individuals, everything will be great. And we want to codify our process of doing this in law. And if we can't get it in law, we're going to have it in executive orders. That's my commentary. I'm sorry. So here's some other things that's in this executive order that I think is important. It talks about federal funds. And there have been enough attorneys in the ACLU and enough folks that have said, first off, that if there's any attempt to, quote unquote, defund a state or local jurisdiction that has these welcoming community policies, that they will face immediate challenge in the court, and there is less of a likelihood of that being successful. So what will happen is, what you'll probably see it is related to grants. And we've already seen this in justice assistant grants, that you run the risk of being of not receiving justice assistance grants because they can't move forward around defunding jurisdictions the way they want to, where it's laid out in this particular executive order. I just want to hit a couple more pieces with this real quick. The biggest change that we've seen, or one of the biggest changes we've seen too, is enforcement priorities. So we know under President Obama, ICE and Homeland Security was very active as it relates to federal immigration enforcement. We know that. But we know that they had priorities in terms of where they focused, right? Those individuals that they could articulate as being a risk to public safety based on their previous history or their current status. And we know this president and this executive order sort of said all bets are off. We're going to widen the net in terms of the priorities. Included in that is convicted of a criminal offense, being charged with a criminal offense, committed acts that constitute a chargeable criminal offense. So you don't have to be charged to have done it, but if it's perceived that you committed an act that is chargeable, then we believe you're undocumented, now you fall within the scope here. Has engaged in fraud and willful misrepresentation in connection with any official matter related to a governmental agency. Have abused any program related to receipt of public benefits, and the list goes on. So that's part of that. There was also a push to hire 10,000 additional immigration officials. And I'll say one more thing as it relates to, quote unquote, as they put it here, sanctuary jurisdictions. They leave it up to the discretion of the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to essentially decide which jurisdictions are sanctuary jurisdictions and which aren't. And we've seen to this point, and that's in Section 9. A gives the Attorney General and the Secretary of Jurisdiction. B and C, I call their public shaming part of this executive order. So essentially what happens in B is to better inform the public regarding public safety threats associated with sanctuary jurisdictions, that the Secretary has the authority to utilize what they call the Decline Detainer Outcome Report. So in other words, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, jurisdictions, and I'll speak to it now. So in the sheriff's office, if we have someone that gets arrested and they're detained in our facility, here's what happens. A person that comes in, they get their fingerprints rolled, right? So we take your fingerprints and we send your fingerprints through a system we call APHIS, which is, you can't, I'm sorry, so if I step out, you can't hear me, I'm sorry. So a person that gets detained, they get their fingerprints rolled, and through an automated system, the APHIS system, I think is Automated Fingerprint Identification System, that information gets sent to a federal database. Years ago, Homeland Security, ICE, connected their system to the federal database. So what happens is when those fingerprints get rolled and they get sent up into the federal database, if that person is listed as undocumented, it automatically flags the ICE system. So we don't have to report it. The fact that we take the prints, which we're required to do, and send them into the federal database, which we're required to do because we want to see if that person's wanted in other situations, ICE automatically finds that information out. Then one of their officers will send to the respective jurisdiction what they call a detainer request. It is a request. And essentially what it says is, look, after you have taken care, that person's taken care of their local responsibilities, we want you to hold them up to 48 hours so before you release them so we can come get them. What's wrong with that? First off, it's a request, it's not an order. And there's this thing called the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, right, that protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures. And if that person's process at the state and local level has been taken care of, we don't have the authority to hold that person beyond that period of time. What the request is requiring us to do is essentially violate that person's constitutional rights. So some people will argue, well, if they're not a citizen, they're not afforded those constitutional rights. We know that that's not true, that the Constitution protects who? Everybody that's in the country, irrespective of, quote unquote, your documentation status, citizenship, blah, blah, blah. And in some regards, if you're not a citizen of this country, you are afforded different kinds of rights to protect you. And some of that is codified in the Vienna Convention document, right? We have to notify, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So here's the point. So what we have said is, no, if all you give us is a detainer, we're not going to hold them. And if anybody paid attention to an article that was in the Free Press a few weeks ago where the head of ICE in Detroit sort of called out Washtenaw County for releasing this dangerous criminal, there are a couple of things that were factually inaccurate there. And although we released a press release, that was not followed up. The bottom line there was simply this. They never sent us the request in time the person was already gone. But even if they had sent it to us as a request, we would have said, can you tell us why we should hold this person beyond the time that should be held? So let me park that real quick and get away from this particular EO. So you got this one executive order followed by really, really quick on the same day, the Border Security Immigration Enforcement Improvements, EO. The highlights there were essentially the same, except for this. Well, actually in both of them, but they talk about it explicitly here in terms of enlisting state and local law enforcement agencies to join them in immigration enforcement, to expand what is called the 287G program. And the 287G program is simply this, is a section in the Immigration Act that essentially says that the federal government can enter into a memorandum of agreement between the governor and a local state or a local police department and essentially deputize them to enforce immigration law. So they have to go through special training, do a bunch of stuff, but now what you've done is you've expanded the reach in terms of enforcing immigration law. And what it says is you have to do it under supervision and all that kind of stuff. What is wrong with that picture from our perspective? Why wouldn't we agree with that? It's rhetorical. Or not rhetorical. Actually, it's not rhetorical. I want to answer. Why wouldn't we agree with that? So some of it is cost, right? So even if they say, look, Sheriff, the cost is free. We're going to do the training for you. We still got to backfill and all that other kind of stuff. So some of it is cost. Why else wouldn't we do it?
For one, that's not what we elect to choose a sheriff. Right. And we know what your officers are supposed to do. That's way out of your jurisdiction. And for two, those officers, if I was an officer and I was doing extra work and not getting paid, I'd have a problem with you. You cannot ask an officer to say, okay, here's all this extra training. We're not going to pay you for it, or we're going to train you for it, but you know what? It's going to take up your time, but we're not going to pay you. Right. Why would anybody agree to that?
So nobody would agree to it, so they'd make us pay it. The labor union would make us. But to your point is simply this. Let's go back to one point before that. That's not our role, right? So what is our success grounded on? At the local level, our success, listen, we solve crimes. We address issues in the community. We make issues strong. We make communities stronger and more sustainable based on one primary premise: a strong collaborative partnership with the people we serve in the community. That's it. And we know that that only exists if you trust us. So if people that are either documented or undocumented. If you think within the course of our interaction, one of the things that I'm going to ask you at some point is your immigration status, whether you're documented or not. How likely are you to continue to make contact with us? How likely are you to partner with us? So even if you're documented, even if you're a U.S. citizen, isn't it sort of insulting at some point for me to ask you whether you're documented or not? So it erodes the trust, it erodes the partnership, and quite frankly, it erodes our sense of being effective in the community. So we stand against that. So these two, what started, okay? House Bill 4105, and I think the other one is 4334, something like that. These are the bills that are in place for the state of Michigan that have passed out of committee. This is what I couldn't remember. One of you may be able to help me. I don't think the House has passed it yet, but it's out of committee. And we know how it happens. Right now, it hasn't passed House. We know it won't come out of committee unless what? They're pretty sure it's gonna survive a House vote. And then we know it goes from the House to the Senate. They might try to change a little bit of it. They might have some kind of reconciliation. It's going to go to the governor. Here's essentially what this is. We testified against this a couple weeks ago. This is pretty much a reiteration of 1373 with some minor things. Now, here's what I don't have. There were some minor tweaks to the part that they passed, and I couldn't get a copy of what they tweaked. But I do have the original proposal. And there are some troubling things. So it talks about no governing body of a local unit of government. It says it shall not enact, enforce any law, ordinance, or policy or rule that limits or prohibits a peace officer or local officer or employee from communicating or cooperating with appropriate federal authorities considering immigration status of an individual in the state. So in other words, it just says it's 1373. We already know that. And any local ordinance, resolution, what you've seen in Ann Arbor and Ypsi and Washtenaw County, none of those resolutions have this in mind because everybody knows that 1373 is federal law and you're not going to enact a local ordinance that contradicts federal law. So first off, this is redundant and not and unnecessary. It also prohibits, it says that the local unit of government must get in writing, make all their employees aware that that they have a duty to cooperate with appropriate federal and state officials concerning enforcement of federal and state immigration laws. I don't know what that means. So I got to write and give them a memo, and it talks about cooperate, but I am concerned about what cooperation means, what it is and what it isn't. So there's a lack of specificity there that should be concerning to us. And here's 9, and they said this was out, but I don't believe it. It says a peace officer who has probable cause to believe that an individual under arrest is not legally present in the United States shall report the individual to the United States Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement Office. My question, which they didn't answer, is what's probable cause to believe? So how am I going to know that? Is it based on what somebody looks like? Based on my assumption of their ethnicity? What is that? Maybe what they mean is if they get information, specific information from a credible source, that they are to follow up on that. But outside of that, that's pretty much in line with what we call racial profile or ethnic profile. So our argument here is what we're doing at the state level is essentially we would be endorsing racial profiling, which is troubling in and of itself. So we need to, so one of the things to think about and what to do, keep an eye on this legislation and be prepared to write to, so not just, so here's the other thing, you guys tell me how this works. Listen, in Washtenaw County, we have really forward-thinking progressive leaders at the state level and at the federal level, right? So if we're writing to those individuals in our jurisdiction, we're preaching to the choir. They already know the arguments. Now, we may write to them, and every now and then I'll talk to them just to give them, from my perspective, we need to be writing to folks outside of our jurisdiction. Or we need to be connecting to our friends that live in jurisdictions that aren't as friendly and encouraging them to write to those individuals. So I'm not saying we don't write letters to our own representatives. But what I'm saying is we should think about a strategy of where we engage outside of Washtenaw County, outside of our district, and educate and engage in that manner. And we must make sure that we also write to the governor. Because if this passes both the House and the Senate, the last hope is for him to veto it. And he needs to hear early and often from folks in terms of what some of the concerns are relative to legislation like this. All right, I don't know how much time I have.
You're doing great.
We're doing okay? All right.
Nobody feels like they're wasting their time.
Well, that's good. That's good. So here's a couple things. So let me say in general why this is so troubling at a local level. There are people that are on the receiving end of these policies and practices that can speak to this far better than I can. I've talked to a number. Here's what we do know, that we run the risk of sending a population of people who, to a large degree, is already underserved deeper into the shadows where they are underserved at an even greater level. I talked to Barbara May Neese, the director of Safe House, and asked her, I said, Barbara, what are you sensing here? She could give me story after story of women that are being abused, that are undocumented, that don't want to tell the police. This is concerning. We've been very open and adamant. I'm going to talk to you about what we've done with our immigration group here, about we don't ask, we're not enforcing, but that only goes so far. And so I asked Barbara, I said, do we have any empirical data that shows that the reporting is down? She says, not empirical, but she can tell anecdotally, just based on her interactions, that people are less likely to report to us. And when we engaged Wicker, and I talked to some of the representatives there and some of the other organizations, they can give us stories and cases where there have been incidents that have occurred where people have chosen not to report it to the police. So what does that mean for us? What that means is for that population to be more likely to be victims of additional crime, right? We also know that it doesn't just stop with the undocumented community. It expands out to the larger community. Here's what we know: crime doesn't know borders. Criminals don't know borders. And whether we are a safe and strong community is predicated on, even at our most challenging parts of our community, are they strong and safe? Because if they're not, that foundation is weak, it starts to spread. Because you start to create this environment where the perpetrators feel more emboldened to expand their reach. So it might not be us today, but we run the risk of undermining what makes our community strong if we don't address these habits, which is why we don't get involved in this type of activity. So you may say, well, Jerry, what's going on? So Representative Dingell said that we convened a meeting. So shortly after the president's EOs, there was an enforcement activity that happened in Washtenaw County. And that was right before IPSI had their ordinance and Arbor had their ordinance and the county had their ordinance. So before that, there was a lot of panic. So here's what we know. In the absence of facts, myths emerge. And myths and rumor can be dangerous. And it started to run, and people were talking, and we had elected officials want to put this out and put that out. And so, whoop, time out. Let's get everybody together. And here's what we know. It matters little what happens in IPSI if in Ypsilanti Township and Pittsfield they're doing it differently. Or if in Ann Arbor they're doing it differently. Or in Chelsea they're doing it differently. We have to have a collective strategy in Washtenaw County that this is the kind of community we are in Washtenaw County. Here's what we do and what we don't do. And we need to get everybody together and talk about what our policies and practices are so it's a consistent Washtenaw County policy. Oh yeah, and also let's put some facts in place. Here's why we don't say sanctuary city. Because sanctuary city doesn't mean the feds aren't going to come in and continue to do what they do. Welcoming means we welcome you at a local level. Doesn't mean that the feds aren't going to come in and do the things that they do. So we wanted to get everybody together. We got the elected officials together from Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti City, Ypsilanti Township, and Washtenaw County and said collectively, let's come up with a couple of, and we got the law enforcement agencies all together and said, look, are we all on board that we don't enforce federal immigration? They were like, yep. So there are 11 different jurisdictions operating in Washtenaw County if you count state police. So 10, we didn't have the state police there. All said that's not our primary responsibility. And we wanted to list out, and this is still in draft form, so I just wanted you to know that there is what we're developing is what we call an immigration policy FAQ, frequently asked questions. And I'm not going to read it all to you. I can't hand it out to you today because it hasn't all been signed off on. But it says, what is the Immigration Enforcement Policy and Practice Work Group? So it's basically a group of local law enforcement and elected officials that want to make sure everybody has factual information about how we respond to immigration issues in Washtenaw County. And just a couple of things. We want the community to know that they can access law enforcement services in Washtenaw County without fear. That we don't see our role as enforcement federal immigration. Another question is, when does local law enforcement ask about immigration status? So I'm just going to answer questions. It says in bold print, we don't ask your immigration status. When you report a crime, when you're the victim of a crime, when you're the witness of a crime, when you're pulled over, when you're a passenger in the car, when you're a suspect of a crime, we don't ask your immigration status. Now, there's a caveat around when you're arrested. We just want to make sure people know that when you're arrested, so there's two different things: asking about your immigration status and asking, are you a U.S. citizen, for consular notification requirements. So if you are arrested or detained as a foreign national, there is a requirement for us to ascertain your citizenship. If you are not a citizen of the U.S., and you're on a list that we have of foreign national detainees, and you're on that list, we must notify the consulate. That's all. And remember, that's a Department of State, not Department of Justice. So we want to make sure those things are very, very clear. So there is that one. We're not asking about immigration status, just are you a U.S. citizen or not? If you're not on that list, then there's an option. We ask, do you want us to notify or not? If you say no, business as usual. If you say yes, we make the notification. So we just want to make sure that those things are very, very clear, because sometimes that gets sort of confused and people have an issue with that. So this is coming out relatively soon. Just a couple more questions. If you don't help ICE, why do we see local police cars when ICE is taking action in the county? For a couple of reasons. We're there to keep the peace. We oftentimes will have a marked unit on the scene, because usually the ICE operates with unmarked units. People start asking questions, things get out of hand. Here's what we know. Let me just say it this way. ICE has their very narrow role that they play. Look, we're responsible for Washtenaw County. It's very similar to any other federal agency. Look, if a federal law enforcement agency asks for our assistance, we will give it to them, regardless of what they're doing. But that does not mean we have to be active participants in their activity. So if they articulate to us that there's a public safety risk, we want to be there. Because at the end of the day, when they're done, they leave. We must be here to make sure that the pieces are taken care of. There have been times where they've gone in, done enforcement action and left, and there might be a family or some kids there. We want to make sure that they're connected to the appropriate social services. Many of our enforcement agencies, I know the Sheriff's Office, we have connections or at least relationships with advocacy groups where we could even call them and they can help facilitate that. So we will be on the scene. Is there a time when we may actually be involved in the activity? So if they call us and say, look, we have a target that we're looking at and this person poses a public safety threat, that we think they're armed and they're dangerous, we may send our SWAT team or our tactical team to support in that regard. We're not doing the enforcement. It would be negligent on us to say, nope, we're not doing it, and then they mess around, and then something goes wrong, and then all of us are at risk. So that's the role that we play. We do not allocate resources and time for federal immigration enforcement, and I talked a little bit about detainer stuff. So that's coming out. That's coming sometime soon. When it does, we'll make notification, and you guys can get a copy of it and disseminate it. We think that's important information. I know you're going to have questions for me. Let me just show this to you really, really quick. So these are, I won't read them for you, like, thank God. These are 4 documents that we have developed associated with immigration that are policy for the Sheriff's Office. So it went from a one document that was 2 pages that are now 4 documents. Why? Because we wanted clarity. Essentially, as I said before, we don't ask. It's not a primary role for our patrol folks. In corrections, we don't honor a detainer, but there are some caveats there, and if you have questions about the caveats when we do our question and answer, I have our policy related there. And there's the last one is we have some, what we did was a federal immigration enforcement directives. So essentially, we wanted staff to have an understanding of what we want them to do and what we don't want them to do. From our patrol, our deputies, to our correction officers, to our metro dispatch. So I'll just give you an example. If somebody calls in and they say, well, look, we have someone that we believe is violating the law, they'll ask the questions, and they say it's federal immigration law, our dispatchers have been instructed to then just connect them to a federal authority. We're not sending a deputy there because that's not what we do. So we want to make sure that all levels of the organization is very clear in terms of what we do and what we don't do, so there's no confusion. So we don't have dispatchers sending deputies there and then the deputy saying, that's not what we do, and it causes a whole lot of confusion. All right, I tried to cover just a whole bunch of stuff in a short period of time, but it's probably more important that I'm here to answer questions because I know this probably ginned up some questions for you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Linda Levy for inviting Sheriff Clayton today and for making it possible for him to speak. And Chuck is going to take the questions and let the sheriff do it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Chuck. All right. So, have it. Yes.
With all of the jurisdictions in Washtenaw on the same page as far as enforcement, would it still make sense for Pittsfield that doesn't have ordinances like Ann Arbor and Ypsi, would it still make sense for us to try to work with governments to pass the ordinances once we get the Michigan, obviously they're not going to do anything until the state threat is handled, but after that, would it still make sense, or would it be safe to say all's well with law enforcement throughout the county?
I'll say it to you this way. I'm always hesitant to speak in terms of what other jurisdictions should do with their local officials. I don't think it's appropriate. What I do think is appropriate is for you to have a conversation with your local elected official, and then based on that conversation, figure out what your comfort level is. I'll say this: the local officials and the police leadership that was in that room when we talked through all this, that included Pittsfield and Ann Arbor and Township, they were right there. So there was no, there are a lot of different nuances, and we're working through the nuances, but overall, principle-wise, there was no hesitation in terms of where we should be. So I'm pretty comfortable. That being said, I know we introduced one elected official. There's another elected official that came in the room. I just want to make sure we acknowledge it. In the back, County Commissioner Michelle Dietrich. Yes.
Two things. First of all, MLive did report in the beginning of June about the situation where they had asked for you to hold the person 5 hours after you had already let them go.
Oh, okay.
But the other thing is, so I know this is not just locally, it's in other cities across the country. What kind of pushback are you feeling because you're not doing all this ice work?
Can you repeat the question?
So she said, she asked, nationally, everybody's not at the same place. So what kind of pushback or pressure are we feeling here at the local level based on the position that we have taken? I think the article, that incident, I think is pressure. I think when the county, so you had the county, you had Ann Arbor, you had Ypsi. This is going to be controversial for some, but I'm just going to say it. Made their ordinances and their resolutions. I think those were good things. I see the point of explaining to the people in our county what we are, but I don't see the point of waving the red flag and challenging the federal government. Because what that causes us is divert our attention, and it just causes more pressure on us. So I think there's a way of doing it. And I think to some degree how some of those were done sort of waved the flag. Here's my concern, that Washtenaw County, and I could be wrong, this is my personal opinion, is a target now. I think that ICE has shown they're ramping up a little bit of their enforcement activity. What happened at Savas and some other things is an example of that. I think the article that was run it wasn't even close to being true, and the fact that when the facts came out, they still didn't retract this statement. It's just another example of how ICE is going to put pressure on us. And I think they're going to try to hold us to the letter of everything, which is why we have all the policies that we have, which is why in the past when we didn't honor a detainer, we just didn't honor it and we moved on. We have built a process now where we're capturing everything and having every factual document. I believe that Washtenaw County will be on the detainer refusal list, and I think they will make a case out of that. I want to be really, really clear, so you've given me a little bit of space. I won't take a little time, but I want to explain that detainer refusal. There is a qualifier there. Here's the balance that we have to make. Public safety, an individual's constitutional rights, taxpayer dollars. Those three things are paramount in our mind. So the first thing is this. If ICE sends us a detainer and make a request to hold someone, and we have this now in our policy, we'll say no. And what we're asking for is a judicial order, an order coming from the court, not a warrant, an internal warrant from one staff to another, a judicial order. Absent that, if they say, look, Sheriff, this person is a bad actor, that they present a public safety risk, and here's why. And they give us a history of this person being assaultive, or they got pending cases, then we're going to consider that. Because what we don't want to do is have just this black and white blanket statement, and all of a sudden we increase risk. So what our staff has been directed to do at our divisional commander level, that if they present a detainer that doesn't have a judicial order, but they articulate the person being a public safety risk, we will require them to articulate why that person is a risk, and then tell them to go back and get the judicial. Because listen, this could all be solved very simply. Go to the darn judge, articulate probable cause, and get a judicial order. That's all you got to do. We do it at the local level all the time. They swear the warrants at 12 o'clock at night. So all we're saying is, what you're articulating us, go to the judge and get it done. But I think they're doing this on purpose. So here's my point. I'm going to go back. So while they're doing that, then our staff's going to be directed to do their own due diligence. And if we find that what they've articulated is true and that person's a public safety risk, then what we will do is we will inform them 24 hours before that person's supposed to be released that they're going to be released and they are to come get them. So that's the balance, because we still want to honor that person's constitutional rights. And here's the third one. And if we don't, then we expose the county to liability. There have been enough successful lawsuits throughout the country where county sheriff's offices have paid money, or counties have paid money for holding people beyond their time on detainer. So I think it's important that we know this as a community. These are the three things that we're trying to balance. Public safety, constitutional right, taxpayer dollars. And and we're always going to try to make that judgment on what's best. Sir.
So the legislation currently being considered in Michigan has been passed in other states. What has been the impact that it's had? Or is that in the court system? What effectively is, what influence has had sort of in terms of the actual measures that have enforced this in these states? And so it's, in other words, looking ahead, what happens in Michigan, how you struggle against that, and continue to do what you do.
Well, that's a great question. So they have been passed at various levels. So I will tell you what I think is the most impactful one that's been passed is down in Texas. So in Texas, there was a sheriff that got newly elected. Her name is Sally Hernandez, and she made it very clear, we don't enforce the detainer. We're not recognizing, we're not doing it. I don't care what the EO says. She was very strong in that regard. The governor says, well, okay, we're going to take state money. So they passed in Texas at the state level legislation that says if not only, and that's the other part that's in this legislation here, that anyone can bring suit against the local unit of government and that elected official for not adhering. So in Texas, what they've done is the governor took it upon itself to cut their version of revenue sharing. So for that jurisdiction, which was I can't remember the county. I think it was Austin. In Austin, they lost $1 million right away. They took $1 million out of the county coffers. So you've seen that happen at the state level. Now, would our governor do that? I don't know. But you're starting to see those examples. Now, obviously, that's being challenged in court. And we know that the federal executive order hasn't been enacted, and there's a belief that that'll be pushed back again. So we can anticipate, here's what I anticipate, if this becomes law here in Michigan, that there will be those individuals that see, I'll just say Washtenaw County, for example, of not honoring detainers, they'll bring suit. And the elected official, I think, is $7,500. That's the small drop in the bucket. The bigger drop in the bucket, which is our taxpayer dollars, is defending those, right? The dollars that it takes for our attorneys to defend what could be a significant number of suits that are brought against a local unit of government.
What is the reality of Washtenaw County in terms of actual crimes versus the hysteria about criminals?
That's funny that you mentioned that. It's not just in Washtenaw County, it is nationwide. There have been study after study after study that has shown that there is no correlation between increased immigration and crime. Matter of fact, there are studies, and we can pull the studies that show that in communities where immigration has increased, crime has decreased. So this is what I said before, is the scary part about the executive order, especially that first one, the first two that were sent out by the president, of trying to equate immigration with crime. And I've even been counseled by our friends in the advocacy committee, when I've made some statements and presentations, is to not even talk about it in that way, because it just reinforces subconsciously in people's mind, making that connection. So I try to talk about challenging the community and trying to stay away from that. But there's no empirical data to support that. I'll get you in a minute, sir.
I just want to go back what you were saying about the House bills. It is House Bill 4334. I think you said that. Just want to make sure you got the everybody got the number, and then 4105. And when we have a gift, because they did not get passed through the House before the recess, so we have until September to work on, defeating those. It probably will go through the House, and then we'll have to challenge the Senate. But I just want to encourage everybody to do what they can to work to defeat those bills. And like you said, go beyond Washtenaw County, because we know we have the support of Washtenaw County people. Go to the west side of the state. Go to anybody that you know, or we. I just talked to somebody else. We can put out. I work with a coalition that's working against this, and we can send PEG the list, so you know exactly who to write to and who to the moderates that we're trying to challenge. And if you're at your sister's house in Grand Rapids, and you're there for the weekend, they're having a coffee and chat. Go talk to them there. Make the personal commitment to try and let them know. This is going to hurt the Michigan's economy. It's going to hurt Michigan education. The governor is trying to support the global welcoming immigration stance, so that would hurt that as well.
Right. So I think there's
one last question.
Yes.
I have two questions. Sorry, Chuck. What are 2 or 3 things that we in this room could do that would be helpful? And the second question is not on immigration, but I don't often get a chance to hear you in person. Can you give us a quick update on the opioid issue here in Washtenaw County?
I will be really, really quick on both. So I think we started to lay out some of the stuff. So we always talk about an educated community as our best partner. You are the extension of what we're trying to talk about here. So I think what we just said, listen, our challenge is reaching across the people that have that different ideology and that different belief. Some of it is just so ingrained it's not going to change. I think some of it is a lack of information, a lack of factual information. So our ability to articulate the factual information, I think, starts that process. This whole thing about the immigration community growing increases crime. That's not the case. There's enough empirical data to support the fact that that's not the case. So trying to push back in terms of that from a factual standpoint. So I think that's part of it. And yes, please, let's get out of Washtenaw County. Got to get out of our bubble, Washtenaw County. We've already won that war. We won the battle here, not with all, but with most. We got to hit our Jackson partners, our Monroe partners, west side of the state. We got to change enough of the perspective to get the momentum. As far as opiates, listen, it's not gotten better. It's gotten worse. You got fentanyl, you have carfentanil, you have all this. Now, the carfentanil is like the elephant tranquilizer, right? And we're starting to see that those deaths, we're getting spikes in deaths, and from a law enforcement standpoint, it's dangerous because now we have to be really careful in how our staff now handle that, how our dogs now sniff for drugs, so that continues. I'm going to do the shameless plug is here. Look, we have worked with our community mental health and our public health to try to have a larger strategy of how we address both people with behavioral disorders and also substance abuse disorders. Listen, we must model the way of how we don't criminalize mental health issues, we don't criminalize substance abuse issues, and we invest in educational strategies, not enforcement strategies around opiate. Look, we can put the bad guys away. We also got to hit the folks that have the addiction problems through education, through making sure that we get rid of the drugs that are in the gateway drug, which is prescription drugs in the medicine cabinet. How we engage our young folks. You know, all of these type of things. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are models throughout the country that have at least started to do some of this stuff successfully. We can replicate that. Listen, folks, you got it, but we have to invest. We have to invest, and I'm just going to give one shameless plug for the Sheriff's Office. Listen, since we've been in office, we understand our role is not just enforcement. It's not just enforcement, it's community building. So we come in contact with the individuals that are addicted and individuals that may be addicted on an ongoing basis. Our staff will only use enforcement where it's appropriate. Other than that, we're trying to connect folks. So we have to take that philosophy and expand it to all of our public sector factors, and together we might be able to address this. But I'm just going to say here, we got a long way to go around the opiates. We got a long ways to go. Because there are still communities, even here in Washtenaw County, that's in full denial. Or whether it could happen to them, happen to their kids, happen in their community. There's nobody immune. There's no section in Washtenaw County that's immune. We have to collaboratively come up with a strategy for how we address this in the long term. So I am off my soapbox. Chuck's like, would you shut up and get out of the way?
We are indeed honored to have such a competent and compassionate public official. And thank you for taking part of your Sunday to be here. Are you willing to stay for a few more minutes? Okay. So Sheriff Clayton has agreed to spend a little bit more time, answer a few more questions, and why don't we do it as part of Idell's Action Circle meeting. So all of you who are interested in the immigration issue, follow Idell here to a corner of the facility, and you'll be able to continue the conversation. I want to also encourage all of you, and how many of you have your Washtenaw County ID cards? Wow, that's terrific. So it's an easy, painless thing to do. It's not free, but it's easy and painless. My picture is much nicer than the one on my driver's license, and I'm looking forward to using it in lieu of that. Whenever we do that, we're supporting the immigrants in our community. Are there any representatives from the other activist organizations in the county who help publicize this event? If so, I'd appreciate it if you'd identify yourself so we can thank you. Thank you, and you're with?
A2D2, which is Ann Arbor Indivisible Dems.
So,
Indivisible Group.
Yeah, doing wonderful work. Anybody else? Yes.
Just the Washtenaw County Party, which is an exceptionally strong structure and group of people, and I just wanted to reiterate what the young lady said earlier. We have been successfully pushing back all over the state by calling representatives who are not our own. They usually don't ask. Even if you do, I just say, I'm a Michigan constituent, your vote if I speak. And they do take note of what we say. And if you need any help, they have one thing for, especially for immigration, but also for getting specifically who to call, their phone numbers, and issues like the mental health bill, all the other things that they concern solve. Either the county party committee or the Michigan Resistance, which is nonpartisan, will furnish you that information. Find it on Facebook.
So, yeah, if anybody's interested, you're going to stick around for a little bit, right? So they can come see you. Any others? Yes?
Chuck, at the last PEG meeting we had at your house, we talked about potentially looking at a role for PEG in coordinating or at least convening all of the groups that are trying to do similar things, to coordinate calendars, activities, So we're looking to see if PEG can serve a role with all these groups in not a instructive way, but an informational way. So anybody who wants to think about that with me, I'll have a group.
Terrific, absolutely. And we hope that by the time we have our next meeting, which will be in September, our next public speaking, it will be a joint sponsorship of as many of these organizations in the county as who would like to participate with us. We have no particular pride of authorship here. We're all trying to get the same thing done, which is have a government that we can be proud of. Boy, that sounds nice. PEG is also taking on another role besides that of convening or being the catalyst to get the organizations to work more closely together. We are developing a special interest in seeing the percentage of students who vote up. It's got to get much, much higher than it is. And at the University of Michigan, it was 12% of the students voted in the last midterm election. We can and must do better than that. That's a special interest of ours. We understand there's going to be a Big Ten challenge initiated by President Schuschel, who has reached out to the other presidents of the Big Ten universities to, it's going to be a contest to see who can get the highest percentage and who can get the most improvement. And that's something that PEG would like to take a role with. So you can see me at the conclusion of this meeting to discuss that. Vicki, you are interested or willing to talk to folks who care about women's rights and Planned Parenthood? Any other of our leaders here who want to take a, yes?
You know that there's a group that's going to be trying to bring the conversation about single payer, Medicare for all. And it's, I don't know if you know Michigan United, but Michigan United is helping with this effort. And we're going to have a meeting August 17th of anybody who's interested. And then in the fall, we're hoping to have like a panel discussion about single payer. We've got 2 speakers from Physicians for National Health Care that said that they would come. And so if anybody's interested in that, let me know. Should be in the newsletter.
Yes, if you get it to us, it will be in the newsletter. Absolutely. And yes.
So I'm the lead organizer of Our Revolution Michigan, which originally grew out of the Bernie Sanders movement, but definitely includes lots of people who didn't vote for Bernie at this point. Now we're working explicitly to promote. Okay, so I'm the lead organizer of Our Revolution Michigan, which grew out of the Bernie Sanders movement, but is definitely not limited to Bernie Sanders supporters. We have lots of people who supported other candidates who are members now. We're statewide, but we also have local chapters, including the University of Michigan Progressives. We work a lot with students on college campuses, and we're promoting getting progressives to run for 2017 and 2018, especially at the local level. So talking about park commissioners and school board and township trustees. And we're also working on voter registration.
Okay, terrific. So those of you who are going to be conveners, if you will, if you could just stand up first and move to a corner, and then the rest can follow as they see fit.